Hey everybody, this is Chris Wernberg. I do a podcast called the WoFoYo Podcast. Stands for Get in the Word for Yourself. I do it with a buddy of mine that I grew up with named Daryl Malone, and we call ourselves C-Dub and Bones. CW is my initials, so C-Dub was a nickname given to me at work. Bones is something that Daryl has had ever since high school because he's 6'3" and weighed about 140, 150 pounds at 6'3", so he looked like skin and bones. So there's that bit of background. So Verlinda asked me to talk to y'all about podcasting, and I'm going to be very upfront, very honest, and hopefully this helps somebody. And if it doesn't, hey, that's great too. I love Ernie and Verlinda and everybody over there at Eagles Nest Watch. I want to give you a little bit of background into how we got started. And I also want to give you some technical things to consider. Our podcast is called WoFoYo Podcast, stands for Get in the Word for Yourself. And what we found out is through living some experiences and kind of some background is some different things that happened with Bones and I happen simultaneously in our walk with the Lord. Again, we went to the same babysitter growing up and had some different experiences, both joined the military, both hired in after some flip flopping of lives and different things like that, a little bit of leapfrogging of careers. And we ended up working together. And about that time is when Daryl gets saved. And I never seen anybody grow that fast. And so we would start to bounce ideas off one another. And we had this idea that, iron sharpens iron. Well, I got to live it out. So what happens is we start hearing from the Lord. And not only do we start hearing from the Lord, but a couple other people that are kind of extended circles for both of us, we're starting to hear the same things at around the same time to where we would be like, hey, you know what the Lord told me? And it would be finishing the sentence of the other person. And this is kind of part of our testimony. There was some pride that crept in, and where we thought we were going to be some big time ministers because of how much the Lord was revealing to us. Well, guess what? Out to the wilderness you go. And I was having a good time in the wilderness after a while, and me and the Lord were good. And, you can keep the people because I knew how shady they could be. And still, the thing is, you can have love for people, but your love of God has to be first and foremost. And so during all this time, go through some personal trials, go through some times where promises that I had from God looked like they had totally fizzed out, looked like I had totally got it wrong. Here you are thinking you heard from God, and it looks like nothing. When I was about at my lowest, then God reached out and let me know, hey, he's still there. Not only is he still there, but he's in control. And you would think that this just caused everything to miracle itself well, right? Uh-uh. Bottom line is I started to develop this trust walk a little bit more. And in doing that, I was attaining professional success and doing good. And then there's this guy named Mike Ward. And then I find out that this guy has just gotten saved, and I'm the first person that the Lord has told him to talk to. And I'm not saying that I handled it the best. I kind of shocked him the way that I handled it. Anyway, my conversation with the Lord was this: Lord, I know you're calling me back up, and I love you, and I'll do whatever you want me to do because I love you, but don't expect me to like it. And that's about as honest as I can be. And so that was around 2018. And 2019, There was some weather phenomena started talking. And then all of a sudden, the Lord starts talking, or maybe I was just listening better, whatever the case may be. So fast forward to late 2019, rather, the Lord had, I made a joke to Daryl. I go, with all the stuff we've experienced in the church and in the walk that we've had, I said, we could write us a book and call it the Christian Self-Defense Manual, talking about how to protect yourself from all the stuff that goes on. And we laughed. And I get off the phone and the Lord goes, would you? And I'm like, ugh. So I'm like, yeah, I don't know how. So there's a lot of this stuff that it's a trust walk. Okay. So I go, yeah, I would. Bottom line is I start typing. I don't want to get too bogged down in that, but I bought Bones on with that, and the Lord was doing some things simultaneously, like that happens with him and I, that he had already had him started writing things, journaling before I ever even asked. That led to this book. Okay. Christian Self-Defense Manual was released in, I think, November or December of 2020. We get this book done. We had to edit it. That was a learning process. There were some things that came with that kind of led to the podcasting, because we're like, I don't really feel like God's done with us. What's the next step? We prayed about it, and out of the different options that were there, podcasting was the thing that kind of jumped out at us both. And so here we are. So my big thing about that is questions to ask yourself. If you want to know about podcasting, the biggest thing I'm going to say is, are you called to do it? And if you're called to do it, that doesn't mean that it instantly drops in your lap. I am a big proponent of the grace of God. I'm also just as big as proponent of discipline and hard work. Okay. The next thing I'm going to be quite honest about is, what is your message? I know God's called me to do something. Uh-huh. I know God called me to do something back in the early 2000s. And I had a 15-year period where it looked like it's just totally not happening. It looked like I totally missed it. And when I'm going to my old Bibles and looking over these old notes and writing the book, all of a sudden it's like this curve where it was this big valley where none of that was true, and it was all coming to pass over 15 years later. So just because you're called doesn't mean you're called now. These are not easy questions to ask, and these are the questions I ask myself. So when Verlinda asked me to talk to you all about this, I can't help but be honest with you and ask that you be honest with yourselves, because this is a very expensive hobby if you're going to treat it as a hobby. You're going to get out of it what you put into it. But more than that, you got to know who you are. You got to know what your message is. And I'm going to be honest, Bones and I have talked about so much word. We were getting into the word during our downtime at work, and we were growing. And not only that, through that wilderness experience, we had lived a lot of this stuff out. So it wasn't just like people to get out of seminary and, oh, I have this idea of how the word's supposed to work. What we come at you on the WoFoYo podcast with is stuff that we've been through. And if that doesn't sound the most exciting, that's fine. Also, we were both military at one time, so we frame things in a little bit of a military frame of reference. And that's not for everybody. That offends some church folks. That's fine. But you got to know your message. You got to know yourself, and you got to know if you're called. So let's get to some more nuts and bolts type of things now that we've established that. Okay. Are you going to be partnering with someone, or is it just going to be you? I can tell you that there are people that can monologue really, really well. And there are people that work best being able to bounce ideas through conversation. And especially if you're going to be talking about the Word of God, having a group of people, two or more, what's your optimum amount and who would the right people be for you all to be able to bring things out of one another to where the Word of God is having a fuller effect and fuller meaning for the listeners. Okay. And I'm telling you, if you will get yourself out of the way, you got to keep God number one. And then, as far as doing a podcast, actually concern for your listeners should be number two. And then somewhere down the line, you're going to grow in that process. But ego has to get out of the way, or else it's going to be about me, me, me. And just like anything else in the Christian life, you're going to mess it up. Are you better at doing a monologue? Are you better with discussions? How much can you talk before you just start saying the same thing over and over again and the conversation loops on itself? Because that's really boring. Do you and the person that you're talking with, is there a tendency to talk over one another? Because again, you got to think about the listener. So let me tell you what that looks like now. It didn't start out this way for us at WoFoYo. Every Tuesday, we release a conversation. That's one of our regular episodes. Every Friday, it's me doing a monologue and it's a short. And it's really content that I didn't feel would make a good conversational piece because it's just not that much content, but it's still something that's important enough to be brought up. There's also some logistic things I'll get into a little bit later. It just made sense to do it. What is your style? Again, you got to know yourself. What's your message? And especially if you're going to be interviewing folks, uh, there might be folks that you like. Okay. They might be friends, but let's be honest, they're not going to be a good interview. Do certain people monopolize a conversation? If it isn't a good fit, are you willing to put your name on it? And so, yeah, it's about the listener, but you got to think about the listener, the quality of the product. So, like one of the things we're about at WoFoYo is getting into the Word for yourself. So, it's supposed to be when we have conversations, when we have interviews, it is supposed to demonstrate what different people look like as they walk out their Christian walk. And I'll give an example, and I'm not trying to be offensive. I've interviewed people that I go, here's an audio recording. You can have it, but I'm not going to put it on my airtime because the way it worked just wasn't a good fit. Things that make for a really boring conversation for me, for my style. If we're having a conversation and you're able to have a conversation with me, then that's a good fit and you're able to be just you. Because what we're looking here for on the WoFoYo podcast is honesty. If you're reading from a script, you're not going to get airtime because it's just a bad listening experience for the listener. Keep these things in mind. There's something about honesty. There's something about integrity. There is something about sincerity. I'm don't mean to get in the prophetic utterance of the times, but where we're at now as a nation and even globally, there's a paradigm shift going on in one of the biggest currencies in the new economy of ideas is sincerity. And if you are sincere and you're meaning what you say and what you do is lining up with that, that is going to speak volumes and it's going to carry a lot more weight than any credentials you actually might have earned through formal education or anything else or the attaboys that other people give you. Now, here's some nuts and bolts. and I can't emphasize this enough, on the technical aspect of it, homework, homework, homework. There's a technical aspect to podcasting. It would be the same as any trade. The tools of the trade are constantly improving, constantly changing. Some of the laws regarding this equipment and broadcasting and different things like that are in flux. So if you just like the idea of podcasting, you're probably going to have to keep it as an idea. It's going to take some work. And one of the biggest things you're going to have to do earlier on is doing your homework. Google, YouTube are invaluable resources because that can lead you to a plethora of information that is way more specific. Sometimes it can get too specific. So that's kind of why we're doing this. But this is just a primer. You don't like Google, use DuckDuckGo, use whatever search engine that you like. Let's say you're doing an interview style. Are you going to be in the same place? If so, there's going to have to be a physical setup. We'll get into that. Now, what Bones and I do is he lives in Hannibal, Missouri. I live in Jackson, Missouri. And when we get together, it is through an online conferencing thing. So some popular platforms for meetings rather, and podcast, Zoom. That's what this is being recorded on right now. What I have behind me is a green curtain. But as you can see with Zoom, it automatically has the WoFoYo logo on a green screen that's superimposed on this curtain that's behind me. Google Meet, Microsoft Teams, Cisco WebEx, Skype was the first thing that we used, but the audio quality was not as good on Skype as it is on Zoom. Riverside FM is very, very popular for high quality podcasting, especially if you're going to use the video. Zencaster, Squadcast, and Podcastle are also used, but specifically Zencaster and Riverside FM are used when you're getting into some really high quality stuff. Okay. And especially if you're going to have multiple remote participants. Couple other questions. You know your message, you know all this stuff. How often are you going to be podcasting? Once a month? Uh, Once a week? Multiple times a week? How much do you have to say? How can you keep that going? Because one of the names of the game with podcasting, I can tell you, we're getting ready to start season 5 of the WoFoYo podcast, that engagement is key. You have to be able to consistently engage with your audience. If they know to check in every 2 weeks, make sure it's every 2 weeks. If they know that you're going to be producing content twice a week, make sure that you are consistently having that content posted, on those due dates. So communicate what you're going to be doing, commit to the process, and have that ready. It's this called being good for your word. There's another aspect of that. There are what are called podcast hosting sites. Okay. 4 of the big ones are Podbean, Buzzsprout, RSS, and Transistor FM. So what these are is, let's say you've recorded what you need to record and you have this audio recording. Well, there's going to be a couple processes, but eventually for folks to hear it, it's going to have to get uploaded to a hosting site. What we use for the WoFoYo podcast is Buzzsprout. I have 6 hours a month that I've purchased. Cost me just under $30 a month to put that out. There is cost incurred with these things. So again, that's also, as I said, I would mention, one of the reasons we started doing the shorts is because we had excess time left over. And the other thing you're going to find out too, as you begin to do that, and as you kind of get into a groove, let's say you bite the bullet, so to speak, and you start to get into this, you're going to find out you're going to make mistakes. That's fine. Mistakes is what we learn from. But you're going to find out about how long you can go before the conversation starts to get old. With Joe Rogan and some of them guys, that's 3 hours. For Bones and myself, about 45 minutes. We have some podcasts that are longer. We have some that are shorter. We have some that we can have the conversation, but we know for the average listener for the WoFoYo podcast, we keep them at around 45 minutes. And what we found out is that a lot of people are listening on their drive to work, and that's about your average commute. There's all these things that the podcasting site you subscribe to will also provide you metrics that will help you analyze what's going on. Now, since we're a faith-based podcast, that doesn't determine what we're putting into the content. That isn't affecting our trust in God, but at the same time, we would be really stupid not to pay attention to those metrics, if that makes any sense. You're probably asking, okay, well, what kind of setup are you using? All right, equipment is going to be your big initial expense. Okay, right now, what you see here in my camera, I'm using a Yeti Blue digital microphone, cost 150 bucks. This is called a pop filter, has an arm extended out. That whole setup, 150 bucks for the microphone, probably about another 50 for the arm, and the way that it's set up has a clamp that's clamped to a table, and I can move this around, but if I do, it's going to have some audio feedback, so we're not going to do that. I use this setup here. I also got one in my basement. There's better acoustics in this room. I recently purchased an iMac, and so that's the camera that's recording this right now. If I were using the downstairs setup, that is a Mac Mini, and it has a webcam. So Logitech has a 1080p video conferencing camera for under 75 bucks. Again, this camera was built into the Mac that I just bought. That was kind of this year's Christmas present to me. And the thing about this is, if you're using a computer that's older than 5 years old, one of your biggest issues you're going to run into with podcasting is latency. So the other thing is, I'd like to mention, you can see here, they're a little bit fuzzy because of the green screen effect, but these are some Tascam TH05 headphones. They're a specific kind. They're called studio monitor headphones. And the reason it is important to have studio headphones and not just something you bought out of Walmart or Best Buy, unless they say studio headphones, when it comes time to edit and hear how you actually sound, if it has stuff like bass boost, which used to be really popular when I was listening to music, growing up, and all this stuff just had a richer sound, and it's not going to give you a true rendering of how the sound is going to come across. So if you edit it to sound good on adjusted headphones, what everybody else hears is not going to be the same. It's going to be altered. And so again, you got to think of other people, and that's why you use the studio headphones. And these, man, you can get studio headphones from anywhere from about 20 bucks to, man, you can go up to 175. These were about 40. Now, if you're going to be doing things in person, and when I interviewed Dan Blacksher, he said they used a real similar setup for certain things at his church down there in Golden, Mississippi. I used a Zoom pod track. Okay, you can get a setup that you can do up to 4 different mics on a Zoom pod track. It has a thing where you can plug it in, okay, and run electrical to it, or you can run it on AA batteries. It's going to have things on an SD card. It's going to put your audio on an SD card. And again, you're going to have to put in your homework to learn how to operate it It isn't that hard, but you're going to have to continually make adjustments. You're going to have to adjust it for different people and make sure that everything's sounding good for them and sounding good for you. And then it's going to require that editing as it gets ready to be uploaded. So that way everything's in balance. Balance is one of those key things. And how do you do this? Well, you got to listen to what sounds good for you, okay? You've got to make those little adjustments. You got to tinker around with it and find out what you like. That Zoom pod track, I have 3 mics that I have set up for mine, but you can buy that whole rig set up for 4 mics on Amazon for under $500. I think it's right around 450. Another option, and it really depends on how you want to do it. Zoom, if you're going to use Zoom or some other hosting, Zoom costs about $225 a year to renew that. Other questions? Do I want to add video? YouTube, Instagram are all things that you could put the video on. X, Rumble, um, little clips. One of the big reasons that I bought the computer that I have now that you're watching here is I wanted to be able to add some video takes to the WoFoYo podcast and start to upload those on our YouTube page and some of our other social media things. And so it's an investment and it'll pay for itself. If not in actual dollars, it's going to pay for it in the satisfaction of, hey, we have these new capabilities. So in doing that, we're going to be able to reach more people with the message that God has given us. And so that's the win. That's the payoff. Other things about this is marketing. I mentioned adding different video and stuff like that. You can pay people to market your podcast. There's different AI tools that are out there that can help you market your podcast. Not going to say I've been proficient at that, and I could probably stand to do some homework on that, to be quite honest. I have a friend, great dude. He has a business coaching, life coaching company that he owns. He's retired Army, retired infantry, out of Fort Campbell and a couple other places. Great dude, ordained minister. And you know what? Thought about it, prayed about it as we're doing this. Should I use his services to market the WoFoYo podcast? And bottom line was, I really didn't get the go ahead from the Lord on that. Let's say you start your own podcast, might be totally opposite for you. And it's just one of those things you need to know what you're led to do and listen to the voice of the Holy Spirit and, just be willing to be obedient and trust that God's going to bring about, what his intent is. Again, I mentioned that there's things you upload your recordings to, along with that podcasting site. A couple other things that you need to be aware of is you're going to have a logo. So this logo that's behind me, I know you can't see the whole thing, and I've got this feature that's set up on the new computer where the camera follows me a little bit too much, or else I would try and show you like my t-shirt that I have, but then it would just make the camera move. But I have a guy I met named J.C. Bryant. He's from out of Alabama, Roll Tide, and great artist. Okay. Loves the Lord. And we even had same musical taste. I hired him to make this logo. I told him what I wanted. I told him what the idea was, kind of the feel that I wanted. And he just came through in flying colors. Totally satisfied with it. I did that because I knew him and I knew where I wanted to give the money to. I didn't mind giving that money to him. Okay, now, let's say that isn't the case. Let's say you don't know anybody, company called Fiverr that's out there. Man, they're all over the place on price range. If you want any kind of graphic design or anything like that, like a logo, man, you can probably get away from doing something for $20. You can go all the way up to about 100. And one of the things you're going to want though is you're going to want a JPEG file and a PNG file, and especially if you're going to use something like this for the background, make sure you get a PNG file because those translate better onto a background than the JPEG file will. A couple things that's out there to consider too is with the new AI designs, they can come up with some pretty good logos. My only issue with that is two things. Um, as I see more AI generated things, the more they look like AI. You learn how to spot them. The other thing is copyright. So if you were to use something that was AI generated, and with the Adobe Suite, they have some programs that can generate AI images. Those are my images. However, let's say you subscribe to X and they have an AI generator called Grok. Well, Grok could generate the image, but you ain't getting that image off of Grok because that's their copyrighted material. Okay. So you got to check with that. All right. Another thing is once you get your logo, submit it to the copyright office. It's not hard. Just look up how to do it. And the reason I'm mentioning this kind of last is this is what's going to take up most of your time is editing. So you've recorded your interview. You might have got a script together. I would say, man, especially when you're starting out, get a format that you can stick to so that way you just aren't all over the place. And the more you do it, the more you'll be able to flow in and out of the conversation and keep it on point without getting boring. Little tips of the trade. One of the reasons I also bought a Mac is because, as far as editing, the Mac stuff is so user friendly and the processing is so fast that it makes it very user friendly. With the demands that are on my time, I don't have a lot of time to invest in learning a whole bunch of technical stuff. Therefore, for me, I love the Mac stuff. They have a program called GarageBand. The audio that I do for the podcast is edited on GarageBand. The other thing is you can save some presets after you adjust it and all that stuff, and it'll ring it up every time. There's also a video editing thing called iMovie. Once you learn how to use it, it's pretty good stuff. Okay. All the YouTube videos that we did were using GarageBand. They were using iMovie and then another program called Keynote, which is pretty much the same as your PowerPoint. And I won't get into how to do all that, but you can look up how to do all that. Now, my son, it drives him crazy because he works in IT and he's a PC guy. So rather than GarageBand, Audacity is a good audio editing program. And there's other video editing, but if you have the Adobe stuff, the Adobe Suite has video and audio editing. And again, do your homework, put in the time, and be willing to make mistakes. So, one other thing I want to mention, you might want to do a website, you might not. Probably depends on the amount of engagement you're willing to participate in. GoDaddy and Wix, very user friendly at developing websites. You can also have a separate email that's subscribed, that way people can contact you if you want to do that, especially if you're looking to maybe set up speaking engagements, different things like that based upon the podcast, if you want to. The other question is, are you looking to make money off the podcast? Because, man, you got some folks out there and they'll do commercials, they get sponsors and all that. And hey, I'm happy for them. Are you looking to make money off of it? There's things out there like Patreon is one of those where people can subscribe to be like a premium member to listen in. And maybe you provide some special content or some other thing like that. It's kind of crowdfunding. Another guy I like to listen to, Jocko Willink, has something called Red Circle, which is part of what he does. Okay, they host multiple funding for podcast, and his is just one of them. I just want to reiterate, you're going to get out of it what you put into it. I would say that if you are willing to learn, if you're willing to put in some work and humble yourself, make the mistakes, because Lord knows I have. Bring it back to when I was in the Army, I was in the engineers. So when they were teaching us construction, it was the old adage of measure twice and cut once. And it's kind of that way in with the editing and all that stuff, that your editing is going to take most of your time. For every hour that you have of audio content, you're going to spend about an hour and a half to 3 hours. I've been doing it long enough. It's about an hour and a half for me. For every hour of audio content, I'm going to spend an hour and a half editing that, because there are idiosyncrasies that we all have, and you'll go, or, or, or whatnot. There's all those little things we add to the conversation that, especially if it's audio, it's filler, and it just stinks to have to listen to it. It makes it boring, and especially it just makes for a hard listen. So anyway, put in the work, pray about it, and by all means, Verlinda has my information, and hopefully I'm able to pop in and see you all. And if you want to ask me questions, if you see me around, feel free to ask. Just realize that I'm going to answer you honestly and with the love of God. So, as I always say on the podcast, WoFoYo, get in the word for yourself. Love you all.